Muy buenos días.
Good morning, and welcome to this 11th version of Latam Focus, our annual seminar. At this time, we are joined by Minister Marcel, Minister of Finance of Chile. He will have a conversation with the director of BTG, Cecilia Cifuentes. We will also be with President of BTG Pactual, André Esteves, José Gregorio, Manuel Marfán, and Rodrigo Vergara. They will be part of a panel led by Marily Luders. Let's start with the good news, Minister. This is part of a scenario where Chile is expected to grow between 2 and 2.5% this year. It's a little higher than the projected value. However, at first glance, what would seem to be good news, well, we also need to understand that we will probably be growing less than the world, and that will make it difficult for us to address social demands. I'd like to insist on a point that is a priority: how to recover investment and savings, human capital, and to revert the institutional deterioration. Our capital markets have endured several blows, some external, but some internal, such as the damage that took place with the withdrawals in the social pensions. We are not trying to defend our financial company, but it is a reality that is backed by data. Chileans are facing the consequences of a capital market that is deteriorated day to day. So we need to seek policies that will promote capital development, and more of obstacles are not necessarily a proper way to improve things. A deeper capital market favors consumers and is an excellent way to promote formal employment by means of greater resource availability and better investment decisions. There's been a lot of talk about the impact that the tax reform in 2014 had, but in practice, in my opinion, it slowed everything down, and it was the beginning of Chile's decline. It somehow sacrificed growth and meritocracy. Of course, equality is a value, but it can't be the only one. So, given this possibility, the difficulties in the fiscal world, we need to find ways to offer greater social benefits while encouraging economic activity with corporate investment and incentives to SMEs. But the issue is that some of the measures proposed to compensate these reductions may lead to not collecting the monies that are expected, but also to damage capital markets. For example, an increase of taxes to capital gains and to dividends. A few pieces of information. Last year, the stock market made $110 million a day. The volume of the stock market in New York was of $120 million a year. So we're 50-50 in Chile. It's not the reality in Latin America. In Peru, for example, a more dramatic case, there's only $4 million in their stock market. In New York, in Peruvian stocks is $150 million. So Peru exported its capital market. It doesn't happen in their local market anymore. It's in other locations. The same with Colombia. Why? Because it's a mix of factors: legal certainty, competitiveness, tax competitiveness. And in Peru, years ago, we established taxes on capital gains. And in those countries, when companies start to think about stock, they think about New York, not their local market. Brazil, on the contrary, is a vibrant financial market. The transactions in Brazil have a volume of $750 million, and we see that in Chile. There's a lot of Brazilian investment. So in Chile, the entire year's volume is 1 week in Brazil. So the tax situation is quite complex because one tax here compensates with another there. But understanding the need to fund and finance the state, I make a call to take care of the capital markets. Increasing taxes to capital gains does not help in that direction, and adding taxes to dividends does not either. It reduces the incentive. It's an incentive for companies to pay less dividends, and therefore it discourages investment in stocks. It is a blow to the stock market, and perhaps we should have a more efficient way of doing things, combating informality, attracting capital, not scaring them off, because there's nothing more cowardly and irrational than capital. One last reflection. The uncertainty that we've seen in investment, stagnated investment in Chile, is not only combated with stable public policies, but also with a public discourse that backs these measures, that supports them, because every announcement, every proposal, every idea needs to consider the potential effects of including them in all debate. Good example was the tax on the super rich, on assets, and this did not prosper. But there was a relevant factor in the exodus of $30 million by individuals and companies in 2022 and during the pandemic. And this was in bonds and investment funds. That is money that funded projects, generated investment and employment, and now it's doing so elsewhere. This does not mean that we shouldn't debate these ideas, but we need to do so not only calculating the potential tax collection, which is debatable, because if an activity is going to be taxed, it will be affected, but also thinking of the collateral effects that may exist. Finally, I hope that these reflections may help us revitalize and deepen our capital markets, because they do foster all areas of the economy and perhaps reach that expected recovery of our country's economy. I would like to now offer the floor to our minister. And it was mentioned in the video, we would like to show you the new digital platform of BTG Pactual. It is available on your cell phones and on web. It has a user interface that is completely revamped. We launched it last week with new tools, with an open architecture that will be very useful to manage your investments. The main market monitor is there, but there is a much better platform with service applications. It is called BTG Pactual Investments. You can download it, or you can also download it on the website to your computers. That's all for me. And as I mentioned, we're here with Minister Marcel. There's two chairs. So the minister will make a presentation, and then Cecilia Cifuentes, director and economist, will be leading a conversation. Cecilia and Minister, you have the floor.
Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Es un gusto estar nuevamente acá.
Good morning. Welcome to this annual seminar by BTG Pactual to share a few ideas on the current situation and the future of our economy. This presentation takes place just when the central bank updated the national accounts, so there's some fresh information that we can share with you. I do have to go a little fast because I've been pressed in time, and the idea is to leave some time afterwards to talk to Cecilia. Well, let's say that the Chilean economy has overcome the imbalances set by the social unrest and later by the pandemic, and of course all the policies that responded to the pandemic much of what's happening has to do with this, with the over-expansion of internal demand in 2021, with a combination of mass fiscal transfers and the withdrawal of pension funds. And we see figures for activity that are consistent with the national accounts that were provided yesterday. And what's interesting here is growth is pretty much in red. That's what the year has been like, 0.2%. The point of inflection in the economy took place in July last year, and since then we've had an expansion every month. December was an exception, and the last 2 quarters of 2023 were quarters where we saw growth, and we believe that the first quarter of 2024 will be the same. In the next graph, we have a yellow dot for the IMASEC, which is the monthly measure. And in soccer terms, I tend to see a U there. And we need to follow that and continue to project it until it turns into a J. And that will allow us to take off this year, as the CEO mentioned, or the president mentioned. And this is a reflection of what the economy underwent in order to fight inflation, and it is what happened during 2023 with internal demand. There was a significant contraction, especially on the side of consumption, and that allowed reducing the inflation pressures. In the next graph, we're going to see that it allowed us to take inflation to figures that are closer to the central bank's goals. Private consumption was reduced. The durable goods also grew in 2021. So with this, inflation has had the trajectory we see on the screen. Here in the last period, we include figures of the referential CPI. We see the INE consumption, and we've started to see figures between 3% and 4%, including underlying inflation, and that was a period that truly concerned us. It didn't really reduce the inflation in full, but now it has had a significant drop since May last year. And at the same time, of course, these imbalances were not only reflected on inflation, also on the payment balance. And 3 times our historical average, really. So now we're back to the decimal in this historic average. This has been possible given that savings have recuperated after the pandemic. And on capital accounts, we had a direct foreign investment that was record in 2023, practically a decade, and capital outflows were also diminished. We see on the right-hand side how our liquid assets behaved abroad, pension funds and others, and that is not 100% compatible with what the CEO mentioned earlier regarding the capital outflows, because as you can see there, most of those happened at the end of 2020 and 2021, not when we were discussing the tax reform. Now, what concerns us is the value of the dollar. The dollar is high. We see on the graph on the left how the dollar has behaved and the exchange rate has behaved with compared to the U.S. and it's comparable to Chile's currency. We see that in Chile we've had a depreciation of our currency that has been greater than other countries, and that is reflected by what we see on the right-hand side. We have advanced faster in standardizing our monetary policy, so this gap with the interest rates in the U.S. has become larger. And the projection to December 2024, well, we believe that will continue to be a significant gap throughout the rest of the year. We will simply have to wait until it starts to normalize in the U.S., the monetary policy in the U.S., so that we can see an exchange rate that is closer to our historical rates. Of course, it will also be important for inflationary adjustment, what has been done in terms of monetary policy. Monetary policy, simply as in its order of magnitude, has tended to have a 6-month lag. So we see a trajectory with inflation rates that are much higher. They used to be much higher than they are now. So the economy is growing. If we take the growth trend from July 23 to January 24, it's been around 0.3% a month, and that is equivalent to over 3% a year. That is the trend and speed of our economy at this point, with recovery after the adjustment that we experimented. In the right-hand side graph, we see the IMASEC expressed in different sectors, especially, as is the case of commerce. It would seem to be changing and improving after the stress it experienced in consumption in previous months. Other sectors have been more consistent in their recovery. The services was hit hard during the crisis. It has had a very consistent recovery, but there's other sectors that are lagging behind, such as construction. Now, with the expansion we've had in activities, considering that the labor market has responded with a lag in their activity as well, we see the improvements plus that we've experienced, plus the ones we hope to have. The market should improve. The picture today, looking at the history of the past few years, is that paid work is above the pandemic levels. It is pretty much following the trend of paid work levels compared to non-paid work.
Durante estos días hemos discutido mucho sobre el aumento del empleo informal.
And in this comparison, we're making the comparison with wage worker situation in previous years. Why has this not been the case? Because the labor force, which we call as secondary, which is under 24 years of age or over 60, they still have a lower participation rate than before the pandemic. These are the sectors that are expanding in the wage unpaid
y por lo tanto
wage workers. And for unremunerated workers, domestic workers, we are far behind levels before the pandemic. Beneath that, we have the occupation rate. It reflects pretty much the same. The employment rate is similar to the one we had in 2020, and in the case of so we've had a negative tone, a very pessimistic tone. There's been very harsh words said. There's been talk of recession and negative words been said about the economy, but at the same time, it is very interesting that when we look at the expectations of other companies, of consumers, we see a better situation going back to levels we saw before the social unrest. We do see some improvement, but the interesting thing is this level of economic uncertainty calculated by the central bank. We see that in the last few weeks, we have reached levels equivalent to what we saw before the social unrest. And there has been a lot of uncertainty. We see it in our index, but it's been a relatively long period of consistent drops in the economy. So in public finance in 2022, we have been able to revert this situation. In 2021, the public expenditure ended up being 30% more than we had forecasted, and the index reached around 8% of the GDP. The structural index was 11% of the GDP.
Las finanzas públicas.
So we haven't seen those figures in public finances for many years. In 2022, we were able to revert that, but there are some transitory issues therein. Therefore, we have traced a path forward for the fiscal, the balance of payments, and we, as you can see here on the comparison, when you compare the targets and the actuals that were recorded for 2023. That's the final column on the screen. And the only variable for which there is a more noticeable difference in terms of the forecast for the third quarter is the GDP debt ratio. With the new national account situation, we see a higher nominal GDP, and that is down to 39.4%. And that difference there, the difference between the forecast in the fourth quarter 2023 versus the actuals is interesting, and that can be explained by several different components. We have a higher debt abroad, our GDP is in pesos, so clearly we have also seen an increase in the dollar, and that leads to an increase in the public debt GDP ratio. You can also see that part of the margin that we had that was helping the financial system to be more resilient has been improved. We have the bank solvency rate. You can see that the banks are all substantially doing better than the statutory indicator in terms of the risk-weighted assets and assets ratio. We have seen that the banks have also recovered from the 2020-21 withdrawals. We have seen that there is still some ways to go so we can speed up this pace, and we need reform to do so. We need a pension market reform in order to pick up the speed, and whether we see changes in terms of the Social Security side or the individual accounts, that's left to be seen. And there has been a discussion there. It's likely that in 6 to 7 years after a pension sector reform, we will return to the pre-pandemic rates. Now, we are in this situation where we have seen that not a single sector has been left behind. The construction sector is slightly lagging, but it's still not behind per se. You can see this information on the graph on the left. We are currently working on a project with a series of measures, some legal, some administrative in nature, in order to continue focusing on housing market, credit and loans, and to buoy up that market. So what are the scenarios we see going forward? We can see the actual IMASEC figures, and we have several different alternatives moving forward. For example, if we focus on the level of IMASEC's January 2024 activity, and we remain that remains a constant over the year without any growth from one month to the next, we will see that the economy would be growing at 1.9% when compared to 2023. Therefore, all of the forecasts referring to 1.7, 1.8%, 1.8 rather, that we have seen over the last few months would have to assume that there would be a drop in the overall economic activity throughout the year. If we are more realistic and we focus on different benchmarks, for example, such as average growth in August 23 to 2024, we would see that there was 3.7% growth. I'm not saying that's what we will achieve, but that is one way to look at it. These are different approaches to address the growth rate. Let's say we work with the average growth rate from January 2012 to January 2019, all the years prior to the social unrest, we would have 2.9% growth rate. And if we were to focus on the fourth decile of growth over a long period of time, from the national accounts, we would have 2.5% growth. This is all according to Ministry of Finance forecasts. So I don't want to say we're being over-optimistic or not too realistic. There have been a lot of comments with regard to the forecast of 2.6%. But today, with the new figures, the data from January, most likely the data from February, we can say that the market is working towards our standard historical figures. And we will, when compared to similar countries, we are working towards that more historical posture. 2023 clearly was a year of less growth in our country than in the other countries similar to Chile, but in 2024, with these figures and at least this 2.5% growth rate, we would be doing better than the average set of countries, which include countries in Latin America as well as other developed nations and developing nations as well that are resource-based. Now, let's look at the different sector rates. According to how we view this, and in keeping with the estimates of the expert committee addressing production, we have certain gaps here. We have other indicators such as the employment rate, and all of this focuses on the economy's idle capacity, which is roughly estimated by the central bank to be at 0.2%. So in 2024 and 2025, this is something that we should be able to overcome. And we will have to boost financial situations, financial conditions, for example, credit in loans in recent years, specifically last year, the situation has been quite limiting and restrictive. You can see the evolution of placements, which is in red, and you can see how that compares to the Asian crisis, the subprime crisis, and others. We have seen how in the most recent past, the behavior of the credit market has been more restrictive than it has during these other crises I just mentioned. Now, inflationary pressure, the inflationary pressure that we had to address created a situation in which the central bank increased its monetary policy rate to extremely high levels. When you compare, there were certain international comparisons that were conducted, and we were very high up in the ranking. And we know for several months now that that has started coming down to a normal level. And let's take a look at the right-hand graph to focus on credit and labor market, or a market activity cycle. You can see the counter-cyclical credit behavior during the COVID crisis, primarily as a result of the central bank measures taken during that period. And now, over recent times, it has been pro-cyclical. So we can revert that, in fact, as you can see that there has been changes in the monetary policy rate, and this is all due to efforts of the central bank to normalize the situation. And we also see room for the banks to gain more activity. You can see on the right in red, that's real placements, total real placements of the banking system. You can see it has been countercyclical in the past, and there have been some record points as well. So I believe that we can recalibrate, if you will, our risk estimates for the Chilean economy. And I also think that we should focus on the banking system's reaction with regard to its own decisions regarding reserves, liquidity, capitalization, above and beyond what is statutory. Now, we have seen that these better financial conditions will lead to recovering the investment sector. Now, on the right, you can see the levels of fixed capital gross generation. You can see the actuals and the 2020, the 3 and the projected. When we focus on forecast private investment per year, that rate, we can see in 2024, the situation continues to be quite weak as far as large projects are concerned, but 2025 looks better. Now, only in the last year, that is, if we compare the forecast from early 23 to the end of 23 for gross fixed capital gross formation, and we compare that to the 5-year previous period, the investment project forecast increased by closely $15 billion. So that's a significant increase. And it's interesting as well because this has been focused on the mining sector. Why do I think it's interesting? Well, because the mining sector, we were actually just having a very intense discussion on the mining royalties. This was adopted, this was agreed upon, and the idea was to set a limit on the taxing for the mining sector. And immediately following that, we saw that key large investment projects in the mining sector came back to life. And so when you have this tax discussion, it creates an interesting situation. Fiscal policy will also contribute to boosting the economy in 2024. The capital markets may increase by 20% when compared to 2023. Current accounts, you can see, should grow 3% roughly this year. And with that, we have also seen progress in terms of meeting our fiscal policy targets. You can see that on the left-hand graph. For this year, we should be dropping structural gap to 1%, 1.9% of the GDP, and thereby consolidating a debt that is less than what we have had in more recent years. As you can see on the right, you can see the forecast trend in terms of capital accounts gross debt. Okay, some other key figures that we should look at today that haven't really focused on our macro discussions. I'm referring to what's going on abroad. There are some interesting foreign trade opportunities here. You can see the CPTPP on the left. And if we calculate at a real sectoral exchange rate for different sectors of the economy, we can see some sectors are gaining in significant advantage, in a comparative advantage rather, more than expected. And you wouldn't expect that usually for a high exchange rate, but we're seeing that. And if we add that to the evolution of product prices, we will also see that other sectors are making progress with regard to their competitiveness rate. And this is quite significant. So when we have exchange rates like the ones we have today, and with a favorable product price situation, one can expect greater development for the export sector, and that favors foreign trade and favors overall economic activity. Now, we can see that different sectors, forecasts for the different sectors, you can see that there's projected increase of 1 million tons from 2022 to 2026 in copper production. We are working on developing the lithium industry as well, and then we have renewable energy sector growing as well, and green hydrogen. All of these areas will allow for us to make greater progress going forward. And that's why when you have a chart guiding us in terms of our course, we have a lot of different activities going on. We have seen that there are 36 initiatives related to boosting investment, productivity, and the formal economy. We have other, as we mentioned, income tax projects underway, among other activities that are all boding well for the economy. Here you can see what I referred to earlier in terms of an increase in the mining sector investments from 7.6 billion to 28.1 billion for the 5-year period. And this takes into consideration the record from the beginning of last year to the end of last year. So this is the overall 5-year projected investment portfolio for that sector. Juan Guillermo referred to social needs. Here we have a survey on social needs, and 3 key issues seem to be a priority for the fiscal compact. I am almost done. I know that there's a discussion ahead with Cecilia, but allow me to mention, prior to wrapping up my part, that it is important to take full advantage of these opportunities. We are seeing updated figures, the economy is bouncing back, and let's truly take advantage of this to recalculate what the future will be like. So far, we don't see any major barriers for Chile's growth this year, apart from the current ones in existence. But so let's take advantage of this opportunity to boost our growth potential. To that end, we have an agenda. My colleagues in the first row here have assessed that agenda. They're my calculations based on the financial committee's estimates, but again, 3% growth seems to be low, but we have to admit that there are very few countries that, while developing, are able to revert a negative growth rate and negative production rate. So we, fortunately, have seen changes in the global economy that tend to favor our activity based on what we produce and what we don't produce. So we simply cannot let this go. And the people tend to say, okay, the government has 2 more years, and 2 more years will fix everything. But that's not how it works. When you have a 4-year term, the government starts where the other government left off. And if we have a good economy that's handed over to the new government, the situation will be picked up as such. And the incoming government will be at a much better standing when starting. And these are issues that are not related to political calculations, and if we were to do political calculations, I'm sure no one would win. And let's take advantage of the more glass half full situation we have today. In the recent months, we have been doing quite better, and so let's focus on the positive so that we can be motivated and reach agreements and consensus among all so that we can all be headed in the same direction. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you for the honor of sharing this space with us. There's a lot of interest in hearing you. The room is full. There's a few seats up here in case anyone would like to sit.
Disponibles para los que quieran pasar. Bueno, no importa, ministro, que haya parado.
Well, it's not really a problem that you stopped there. That's what I wanted to talk about. You made a full analysis of the current situation. I agree that at least this year it would seem that we're going to recover what the central bank deems is part of our growth trend, but it's very little. 2% growth for the population, growing a little more than 1% is per capita growth that we would have to tell the population, you know, things look difficult. It's difficult for us to solve those social challenges that we have as a country, and there is an underlying issue, which is productivity. These last 30 years, well, the first 10 are growth, productivity-based growth, and then we had growth more based on the mining boom, not so much productivity, and then we have stagnated productivity in the last 10 years. How do we change this? How do we revert this trend? Because in Chile, because we see that the pillars of growth and productivity, with the institutionality, with savings and human capital, there's huge deficits. So could you please say what you would do to change this and for Chile to have elements of growth as it did in the past?
Bueno, yo creo que en esto de la productividad, una cosa que es importante.
I think that something we should make a note of with productivity is that there is a global discussion on productivity. The drop in productivity is a cross-cutting phenomenon worldwide, and many economists are thinking about what it means, why it's happening, how we can change it. But speaking for Chile, we have the figures that you mentioned, and we have been discussing this for quite some time. But to discuss productivity, we need to understand that productivity, the way economists understand it, is a residue. And some say it's a summary of our ignorance because it's everything that the economy grows that is not explained by human capital and physical capital. So here, there's a series of things: the efficiency and the use of resources, relative prices, the expansion or not of the productive base. There's several components. I would dare say first that based on the work that the central bank has been doing, we can observe that if we do a productivity analysis in at a corporate level, we would see that the more productive companies do not necessarily grow faster than the others or more. And this has to do with our ability for small and medium-sized companies that are successful can expand and compete with the companies that are already functional and solid in the market. So this brings us to policies for SMEs. In the political world, SMEs are fascinating, but policies aimed at the SMEs are an ongoing challenge because it has to do with a sector that employs a lot of people, where there's a lot of space for innovation, but we also need to make sure that the policies that we design for SMEs won't make their growth difficult, because sometimes smaller companies maybe receive benefits or special treatments that implies losing the benefits when they grow. So we need to be careful. Sometimes we think of exceptions for SMEs with practically everything, so we need to be very selective in justifying how and where we generate a trajectory, a path for these SMEs that wish to grow so they can do it. That is part of what we've been doing with the organizations. I see some familiar faces here with the people that we've been working with to take that direction. So one, the formalization of micro companies is important. There needs to be a tax regime where we can
contabilidad.
advance progressively in terms of accounting, and then a more gradual transition to a full tax regime for them. So new industries that arise or that transform will also make a significant difference in productivity. Mining is capital intensive, but mining is transforming as an industry. And it is becoming more compatible with environmental preservation or conservation. And there's a sort of bottleneck there that happened here in Chile because some of these obstacles can be addressed and then give a new wind to mining. Lithium is a new industry in Chile. There's huge space for that. Renewable energies, we're midway, and we're changing our energy matrix. We're generating half of our energy with renewable sources. We're going to have 0.85% soon. This generates competitive advantages in other industries that are more energy intensive than now. Insofar as we depend on hydrocarbons, and with all the volatility of these hydrocarbons, it didn't make them competitive. So we're going to gain competitiveness, and this is linked to green hydrogen, which is a huge promise in the world, but also for us. So we need to take advantage of these opportunities, and when we calculate the new residue, it will be reflected as an increase in productivity, but it has to do with more structural change in our economy. Well, we kind of look like the poor cousin there, you know? Human capital seems to be that. We haven't been able as a country to fully address quality education. Minister, how do you view this, you know, with what's happening in Atacama and overall? Well, first of all, we need to understand that Chile spends or invests more in education than the average of countries in OECD, and it does it at all levels. So at this point, our problem is not necessarily a problem of resources, and these figures are significant.
15 años. En la OCDE tiene una estadística bien interesante.
There's a very interesting statistic regarding the wages of the teachers, how they've improved in the OECD countries. I think Chile is first or second place in wage increases for teachers. So I think the main step we need to take now is that our discussions on education need to be less on financing, property, and management, and more on content. We've been discussing for many years we've been discussing wages, expenses, funding, who owns the schools. You know, should it be voucher school? Should it be public, private, public, municipal? I mean, we need to be able to take that leap and start discussing content, quality, technology applied to education, because it is quickly expanding in the world. That is our challenge today. The Ministry of Education has been working on a curriculum reform, a significant one, so hopefully that part will come to fruition during this administration. Very interesting. Minister, you mentioned informality. Fortunately, now we're measuring informality. The INE is measuring it, so it's a priority in the agenda now. I see this as very good news that we are dealing with this. And you say that we've recovered the previous levels, but salaried work is very much lagging behind. This has a correlation with investment. And on the other hand, we see that since the pandemic, there's been a huge development of the digital economy. And you would think that with the digital economy, we would be able to advance and control informality. But I feel like it's the opposite, and that we're all buying things in social media, businesses. I think there's something that's moving forward here. But if we're thinking about social rights, good. We're doing great, but where are the duties? Because everybody wants subsidies, but when you need to pay taxes or you buy things on social media or you need to quote, there's reticence. And this is growing, and we have public policies that aim in that direction. But for example, free higher education for some people, leaving that poor is 60% has an enormous cost in terms of university rates.
Para evitar,
How can we address that? We want to provide them with more rights, but we are really falling behind in the individual's ability to meet their tax, pension fund responsibilities. As far as the most immediate situation is concerned, in terms of reducing the informal economy, clearly that is a challenge for Chile. We know what this represents in terms of tax collection from markets. We know how this, if we were to reduce the informal economic sector greater, we would have a more level playing field for commerce, for trade. And there are two key areas related to the reform. One is the project related to meeting tax obligations that is currently under discussion, and this is related, something under discussion today, related to the informal economy. The whole online market is included therein. For example, this includes doing away with tax exemptions for certain imports that surpass a certain threshold. Imports, for example, by way of courier in Chile have grown exorbitantly, and that feeds into the informal economy. And the informal economy tends to under-declare what is imported, and that, again, relates to how many online businesses do not pay taxes. So there are measures underway to address those two situations. For example, we also have economic intelligence against organized crime. There are measures to address mass, widespread imports. For example, an individual today, a regular person, can bring an entire container of products from Asia and channel this through the informal economy. And we do not have the capacity to follow and surveil this. So that's important, and we're working on measures for that. So there are 11 to 12 measures included in the tax compliance package that are all related to produce fines for, penalize or control the informal sector. We have also been working with smaller company associations to address a single tax system, which is quite simplified, allowing the companies to pay a fixed monthly amount so that they can meet all their tax requirements and the pension fund requirements as well. I'm not saying that this is the end-all be-all. I'm sure there's many other measures that can be taken, but today, at least, we have an interesting, consistent suite of initiatives that are aiming at doing what I mentioned. So the informal sector is not a structural attribute of our economy, but at the same time, we can't just ignore it. We need to be more consistent with regard to that policy and those measures, and with that, we will be able to address the different pressures from the interest groups. And the idea, the overall objective is to reduce the percentage of the informal economy. Okay, I think we have 1 minute left. We have 1 month left to sign up for the municipal primary elections. 50 seconds to go. I know that your schedule is quite busy. What reform? The government reforms. Wait, oh, okay, I know what you're talking about. Usually it's said that prior to electoral periods, it's difficult to reach agreements. That tends to be quite common sense because people are under pressure, there's competition, it's more difficult to reach a consensus. Now, if we were to look at last year, we did not reach an agreement as far as the tax reform, but we did reach an agreement with regard to the royalty project. We did reach an agreement with regard to the minimum wage. So there are several examples of a period marked by a great deal of tension because we had the referendum, we had the constitutional counselor elections, but we still reached agreements. We were still able to focus on key consensus. And then if you look to the citizens, the society, citizens are expecting us to reach agreements. There's no way around it. We know what citizens value. They value politicians who fight for their rights, who have limits, and they also value politicians who are willing to dialogue, to have entered to dialogue. And I think that we will be able to make progress. We need to think more along the lines of legislative policy aspects from the citizens' perspective and understand why citizens look so poorly upon our institutions and the Congress, and we need to work together to revert that perspective and revert that trend and to do what we need to do in order to foster growth, to boost equity, reduce the informal economy, and do what I have mentioned. So thank you. Thank you, distinguished minister. Thank you for your time and willingness to speak with us today.
Muchas gracias, ministro, por su palabra.
Thank you, Minister Marcel, for your remarks, and thank you, Cecilia, for your questions. That was very interesting, and we have heard several positive messages. All right, then, let's get back to our agenda, and I would like to give the floor to André Esteves, the president of BTG Pactual.
Gracias, Juan Guillermo.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today at the Latam Focus. Again, I'm going to conduct a very brief analysis of the global context, geopolitics, the global economic situation, and I will refer to primarily the consequences for our economies in Latin America. In 2022, I was speaking at an event with business leaders in Latin America, specifically in Colombia. It was organized by Carlos Lim, fathers and son type event, and there were excellent analyses of the global context. And following my panel, a Mexican friend said to me, well, Andres, you speak in Portuguese, and we understand you perfectly. But that was tongue-in-cheek, so I'm going to change to English so you can understand me better.
Being here once again. Before I say a few words about global economy and geopolitics, I would like to express a special feeling, unfortunately a sad feeling. 5 days before the accident with President Pinheira, he was in Brazil at the BTG offices where he always visits when he's in my country, and where we exchange ideas about Latin America, about our challenge, about what we should do, how we should behave. And we took a very nice picture at the end of our conversation for nothing. It was a special picture. That became a very special picture for me. I think I would like to express for all of you my condolence and sadness and my consternation about the loss of President Pinheira. I think we all lost a fantastic personality, rational, common sense, no matter if you are from the left, from the right. But I think we all lost a great Latin American leader, Sebastián Pinheira. Então, for you, all my condolences. Having said that, let's do an analysis about, I think Minister did a very good analysis about Chile and the global, some global highlights influence Chile. I'll go maybe a little bit more on the macro side. And by the way, I agree general terms with everything that the minister said. But we had, last time that we were here, we had two big challenges. One was the economy, and the other was the geopolitics. Uncertainty everywhere. And we'll discuss both sides. Starting with the economic challenge, here we have some good news. I think from last year, situation improved globally. Doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of challenge, doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of uncertainties. But the key question here 12 months ago or 18 months ago was related to what was the necessary level of interest rates or global interest rates that would definitively cure or mitigate the inflationary pressure that we all went through globally, right? Remember, inflation in the US went to 9%, inflation in Europe crossed double digits, the same in UK. Even in Japan, you had some inflationary pressure. There is part of a solution, not a problem. But everywhere else, inflation became a serious problem. 18 months ago, it was quite unclear about what level of interest rates in US, which is the global monetary policy for all of us, what would be necessary to move back this inflation to our targets. And as a consequence, what was the necessary recession or reduction in economic activity to put this back this train back on track. The good news is that we have this answer. Interest rates in dollars are 525 to 540 to 550, more or less at 540 on a daily basis, and we didn't have a recession. The opposite. The economy decelerates much less than all of us expected a few months ago. We have this answer of what is the necessary interest rates, more or less where we are. The problem is with this last mile of inflation. Inflation is still slightly above our targets, nothing dramatic, but what is happening right now is we are not seeing the expected economic activity reduction coming from this very tight monetary policy. And that's the new question that is disturbing global analysts. And what should be the possibilities of that, and how dangerous this is still disturbing a little bit higher inflation tell us. We just got a temporary relief on inflation and things will get worse again, or we'll need to go further and eventually hold these high global interest rates much higher and especially much longer than people think. That's the question that the markets are asking on a daily basis, and that's why prices are moving in rates and as a consequence in currencies globally. I soon will talk about the consequence of all of that in Latin America. And this is a complex question, because what has been surprising all of us is how resilient U.S. economy has been, with rates moved from, let's say, 0 to 5.4, and especially, in addition to that, a deleverage of the Fed balance sheet, right, that all of you heard about this quantitative tightening that is going on now for about 18 months. The combination of these two factors should be enough to move back the economy, to decelerate the economy, and to do the necessary reduction in the activity to keep inflation under control or at our targets, which is globally 2%. Strange enough, it's not happening. Unemployment or employment is quite strong, and growth continues to be quite strong, and especially global financial conditions are quite strong, or U.S. financial conditions are quite strong. So that's an interesting question. Maybe it's related to the other side of the economic policy, because as you know, you manage both the monetary policy and the fiscal policy. And maybe that's a concern and a highlight, and eventually even a lesson for all of us here in Latin America. In U.S., I think one of the challenges, and certainly we'll discuss that next year, is the size of U.S. deficit. And different from our region, and you saw the minister a few minutes ago talking about how to reduce the deficit and keep things under control, keep the debt, overall gross debt or net debt, but keep the deuda under certain respected limits, impose some discipline. And the same discussion happens in Brazil, the same discussion happens in Colombia as we speak. In Brazil, every day, the front page headline, the front page of the newspapers, you have a fiscal discussion. Government's proposing this, Congress will not accept, but accept this, X, not Y. The minister disagreed, the president likes, dislike. The fiscal debate is happening throughout Latin America, as it should, in order to keep our debt under control. What disturbs me a little bit is this debate doesn't happen in U.S. We are going to a political election in a few months, and one candidate is suggesting we'll continue to increase expenses if there is no tomorrow, and the other wants to promote tax cuts that are intensive enough as there is no tomorrow. And nobody's paying attention on a very high deficit of US. You could always say that, well, but US, they control the global currency, which is the dollar. But even if you are the owner of the printer, there is a limit to print. So we should take notes of these as a yellow light for global economy, and maybe that's the reason why the monetary policy is not giving us the perfect response. But even with this comment, I prefer to say that from 12 or 18 months ago, we had a fantastic evolution. We had a huge uncertainty 1 year ago about where should we go in interest rates. Again, using the dollar as benchmark, should be 5, should be 7, should be 10, should be 12, should be the largest recession ever. And the good news is that it's just 5.5, 5.4, and we don't need a big recession. Maybe we'll need to stay higher for longer, but the levels are the levels that we already know. And I prefer to classify these as very positive news. To conclude this economic piece, I want to say a few words about productivity. It's out of this analysis, but since the minister spoke about that, and it's very difficult from a macro level, and we have many central bankers here that we respect a lot. Chile has a great tradition of very qualified central bankers, but it's quite difficult to measure the productivity evolution. And every time that you use hard data for that, you are vulnerable to big mistakes. But I like the expression that the minister said, when you go to the corporate level. And then I want to say a few words about something that we are all discussing, you are reading almost every day, which is artificial intelligence. I think we are still on the stone age of artificial intelligence, but the productivity gains that will be ahead of us in all of our companies based on artificial intelligence is absolutely remarkable, and it's a game changer. So we are using a lot of initiatives of artificial intelligence in BTG, and don't get worried about, well, this is too sophisticated, this is only ultra-qualified people. It's not. You need to have the basic equipment, and especially you need to have the understanding of the potential of these tools can give to you. But the good use of artificial intelligence that will make the difference and will make the productive gains for your firms. It will be there. All of you will be using. It's much simpler than it looked like. And the key difference about the productivity gain is related to the business people, not the technical people. Us, the business people, understanding the potential of this tool and how much it can transform a process inside our business. So it's happening as we speak. If you, there is some measures for that. If you look at the 20 largest tech companies in the world, the big techs, not only the magnificent seven, but if you look on a broader sense, all of them had layoffs in these last 12, 18 months. It's not because of earnings. Earnings are booming. It's not because of stock market price, because all the stocks are close to all-time highs. It's just productivity gains. And it's happening as we speak. It's not something for the next decade, something for the next century, something that is completely out of our touch. It's happening now. As I said, at BTG, Juan Guillermo mentioned our new apps that you all can use for digital banking. And on this app, you have a lot of artificial intelligence tools, including how you interact, and including the offering, including the prices that you have available. So a lot of tools that are already working. So this is a general comment to incentivize you to get familiar with the concept, because it will be extremely useful for the management of your companies, and a game changer in terms of productivity. So the link of that with the macro scenarios that eventually this will be the world. Inflation will be low, unemployment will be low, growth will be high, and because productivity gains that are difficult to measure, but will be there, especially driven by artificial intelligence. Okay, moving to a simple geopolitical analysis of the world. We had, again, 18 months ago, 12 months ago, a similar question that we had about the economy. How the world will develop, the situation that was tense will evolve. Are we going to the direction of a divisive world? Unfortunately, this doubt about a divisive world is not a doubt anymore. It's a certainty. We are in a divisive world, and we are not coming back. We are still going in the direction of a more divisive world. One big bloc led by US, another big bloc led by China, and these blocs are getting distant from themselves. And you have many consequences of that, from regional conflicts to the increase of protectionist tariffs. In a certain way, we could classify as some level of deglobalization. It's not obvious to call that deglobalization because not necessarily commerce reduced, but a changed routes, not necessarily in a more efficient way. Remember that the best definition of globalization was the global supply chains getting longer, and longer, and more productive. So, and it was extremely positive, right? Very poor countries transformed themselves dramatically. Countries like Vietnam or China that were quite poor became middle-income countries. And countries that were middle-income became, for global standards or OCDE standards, became developed countries like South Korea. So, unfortunately, part of that is reversing back, and much more tensions around us. So it's a negative development from what we discussed here 12 months ago. But not necessarily negative for our region. In which sense? Any big political dislocation, if you go back 500 years of history, even though that can be global net negative, you have winners and losers. The most remarkable of them all is US during the Second War. Of course, was a very bad humanitarian moment for all of us, for all the countries. But economically speaking, was positive for US. So even in a bad context, you can have winners and losers. And us here in Latin America, and applies to Brazil, applies to Chile, applies to Mexico, we are winners on this more divisive world. Why? Because first we have a calm geopolitical region. From time to time, you have some clowns trying to create a confusion like the one in Guyana, but it's such idiot that will not go ahead. So we are a calm, peaceful, geopolitical part of the world. Second, we have good relationships to everybody, right? To US, to Europe, to China, to Middle East, in the neighborhood. So Latin America is connected to the key regions of the world. Countries, of course, have different relationships inside Latam, but overall, we have good relationship to everybody. And third, we are producers of very important demands globally. In which sense? Latin America is the largest food exporter of the world. And if you go and talk to any senior figure in Middle East or China, their key concern is food security. Brazil, for example, individually is the largest food exporter in the world and provide food security for Middle East and China. It's a competitive advantage. Chile is also part of this equation. We, Latin America, and Chile is one of the leaders on that, provide the metals for the energy transition. We are the producers of that. So it's another part of the equation. And finally, we have one of the most competitive energy matrix. So Chile, as Minister said, will be by 2030, 85% renewable energy. Brazil is already 85% renewable energy. No other place in the world can go at this level of renewable energy without big subsidies. Here, we don't need big subsidies. You go there naturally. It's our natural matrix being renewable for most of Latam countries. And don't get me wrong. When we talk about industrial policy, and in Brazil, we still have some old-fashioned debates about industrial policy. The new reindustrialization will be driven by where is the cheapest and especially the cleanest energy. And this could be a source, an important source, an edge, an opportunity for us in the region to benefit from this new trend, this new reorganization of global supply chains. The combination of this factor bring us to a very positive position. I give you two concrete examples. Last year, I was in Mexico, and I flew by helicopter in the Carretera Norte, the road that links Mexico City to US. And I flew by about 1 hour. And the amount of logistics investments that you see, you don't measure, it's not any statistics. You see with your eye, huge distribution centers, logistics facilities, very modern, very big, the size or the sophistication of those in China. And in no other place in the world you can see that thing. So it's happening, right? Another concrete example, in November of last year, Brazil promoted transmission line auctions, energy transmission line. Every year you have that in Brazil. Brazil is a continental-sized country, so very important, the connection of the generation with the consumer centers. So we need to constantly improve your transmission line, the grid. And every year we have auctions. And last year, there was a big line with a high power line, big investment. And the winner of the auction was State Grid. State Grid is a big energy infrastructure Chinese company. And it's an FDI, a foreign direct investment, of about $4.5 billion, the size of the project. BTG is the project finance advisor of State Grid. $4.5 billion of FDI in an individual project is one of the largest announced in 2023. It's bigger than the Intel chip factory in Texas. That was a big investment announced by the president of US. This one is bigger. In relatively short term, because the transmission line will be in 4 years. 4 years from now, it will be there. The transmission line will be there, and these $4.5 billion will be invested in the country. And why this happening? Of course, a good Brazil will have a good legal framework on the energy sector, good opportunity, reasonable return, but there is something else, not related to Brazil or Latam, related to the globe, related to what I spoke about geopolitics. Why? If you are a Chinese infrastructure company and you want, you should, or you must invest outside China, you cannot do that in US. You cannot do that in Europe. You cannot do that in Australia. You cannot do that in Canada. In India, probably not. Okay, you can do that in Middle East, but they don't need your money. They're doing with their own money. You can do that in Africa, but Africa, not the rule of law, relatively small, more confusing. So this is the opportunity, because here they can do the investment. No restriction for a Chinese infrastructure company come here and do a transmission line in Chile, in Brazil, or even Mexico, that is a neighbor of US. So that's an opportunity for all of us doing business in this region. So finally, when you analyze the economic scenario, geopolitical scenario, how we think about markets, as I said, well, today is a special week, right? Tomorrow is a Fed monetary policy meeting, and many of our central banks will meet. including many of Latin America's central banks. Here, I think we executed in Latam very proactive monetary policy. As I said, I mentioned here, tradition of competent central banks. Chile was a pioneer independent central bank in Latin America, but most of our central banks probably traumatized by our inflationary past many decades ago, are very cautious, and we acted in a much more efficient way, in a much more preemptive way than the G7 central banks. I think central banks globally, or the G7 ones, they were delayed about what was going, the inflationary phenomenon. They were not as educated as us, not as prepared as us, and not as alert as us probably regarding this phenomenon. And the consequence for that is in our countries in Latam, we already started to reduce interest rates. Chile will be reducing by 400 bips, Brazil by 300 bips, Colombia the same, Mexico soon with the same. So we are already releasing, relaxing our monetary policy, while the key question for us globally is if U.S., when it will start. The key discussion this Wednesday at the Fed or at the markets today is if the Fed will suggest they have a system of dots that is quite unique for the Fed, if they will suggest 3 cuts this year or 2 cuts this year. I think they are at the 3 cut instance at this moment, and I think they will keep that. Probably will be good for the markets if they do that, but that's the key question for us to answer. Is less related to Chile, Mexico, or Brazil, more related to we need some relief in global monetary policy led by U.S. Situation in Europe and UK is completely different, right? These regions are in technical recession, but you cannot move on a very different way of the Fed. So this more conservative and this doubt about U.S. monetary policy that is holding these interest rates still high, and especially dollar quite strong. Regarding the dollar, I will do a final comment to conclude this short presentation about capital markets. So we mentioned here capital markets. Juan Guillermo mentioned capital markets. And sometimes we are macro people in our region especially, and we try to look for macro phenomena to explain the strength of a certain currency and not. And but I would say that we have a little bit original view regarding the dollar. The strength of the dollar is a more microeconomic event than macroeconomic event. Okay, you have high interest rates for global standards or for U.S. standards, but especially you have ultra strong U.S. capital markets. If you look in the BTG apps throughout Latam, huge demand from Brazilians or Mexicans or Chileans to buy Apple stock, Bitcoin, NVIDIA stock, and NVIDIA in 24 months moved from a couple $2 billion to a $2 trillion company. Right? I repeat, it's $2 trillion of wealth creation. It's amazing. And when you go back 30 years in history and remember the concept of emerging markets, it was high growth, wealth creation, the new frontiers of business being created, which fits extremely well to Silicon Valley. So in a certain way, U.S. is taking over, or this U.S. tech is taking over these emerging market brands, and unfortunately has some consequence for our business. So part of the liquidity drag of emerging market capital markets, and it's not a Chilean issue or a Mexican issue, a Colombian issue, it's also a South African issue, it's a Korean issue, it's a Canada issue, and also a Brazilian issue. Part of this market were captured by this extremely successful, probably with some exaggeration, of U.S. capital markets. So these are simple thoughts and updates on how we see the global scene. And you have a much more qualified debate now with our colleagues from Chilean Central Bank. And once again, I would like to thank you very much for being here with us. It's a pleasure to have this simple event and discuss all the relevant topics, okay? Thank you very much.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Andrés. Y para terminar,
Thank you, Andrés. Now we will move on to our panel of experts. André already introduced them. We have former presidents of the Chilean Central Bank, Rodrigo Vergara, José de Gregorio, Manuel Marfán. And the moderator of this panel will be Marily Luders.
Hola. Así que ahora se escucha, así que
Hola a todos, muy buenos días. Gracias por
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Guillermo, for the invitation. Thank you to my three panelists. I am Marily Luders from Extent, and I'm a journalist. I'm formal director of the financial newspaper, and it's a pleasure, luxury, in fact, to have these panel members with us. I feel as though I don't even need to introduce you all because you have all held all the various posts at the central bank, and you are well known in academia. So this morning, my WhatsApp was flooded with comments by many of you who are here and others who are not here, and this was related to a specific question, so I would like to start with that question. So the central bank made an announcement with regard to the national accounts as saying the 0.2% growth from last year, and apparently this has resulted in a change in the discussion. So the government publicly mentioned that it's going to try that this is a launch pad, and there has been, if you will, propaganda about growing Chile, and there have been very optimistic comments thus far. So the question is this, do you agree with this? Do you think this figure is telltale of the better, brighter future? Thank you, Marily. 0.2 is not a celebratory figure. We can barely hear you. There we go. Now you can hear me better. 0.2 is not a cause for celebration. It's nice to see that we have surpassed the zero mark, but it is true, though, that 2023 was not a great year, but in the final months of the year, at least we saw upward growth trend in the non-mining GDP. And I hope that that remains as such. 0.2% means that the government will not have resources to fund public spending from growth. And if the growth rate were actually 2%, that's not enough either. I like that the government has changed its tone with regard to several things. People would have enjoyed to hear these comments at the beginning. So this nice change in discourse is positive. That's right. The national lithium firm, for example, is one of the announcements, positive change in discourse. And it's going to be tendered to the private sector. There was a public-private partnership that was announced in Magallanes as well for clean energy development and for green hydrogen development. So I have seen pro-growth initiatives. I have seen changes in the overall direction, and these are favorable changes. I get the feeling that this will foster growth in the long term, as long as these initiatives come to fruition, but this is a slow-going process. And I think we're dealing with something else that's important right now. People want more resources for public security and safety. More resources for the PGU. What about the CAF reform? 2%, the most recent report issued by the autonomous group on March 11th is very pessimistic as far as the fiscal compact is concerned. I haven't seen that tone in any of the previous reports. Therefore, any agreement that could be reached in terms of increasing tax collection are key. They're key because failure there could result in failure for all the other efforts. Now, the most prosperous project is related to anti-tax evasion, and this was unanimously adopted by the Senate's Finance Committee. Just let me finish. But I wouldn't be surprised if there were one or two politicians who would say that they would be better off winning the elections if the government didn't do well, so they would end up boycotting this process. It hasn't happened yet, but it has happened in the past, and I don't think that's good. I think that's bad. I think that is detrimental to the entire country, and I think that is detrimental to society and to business as a whole. I think Chile has a good opportunity today. We have these new wins, this new discourse from the administration, and I think it's a good opportunity to go forward with a pro-growth agenda, but in the short term, resources are needed for the fiscal coffers. Do you think this announcement related to 0.2, what do you think about that? Well, 0.2 is not a good growth figure. I agree with Manuel. But I also understand the minister's enthusiasm in that we expected less. We expected less today, and we expected less in the past. So generally speaking, in recent times, the projections and estimates and forecasts have been more pessimistic than the actual reality. So I understand. I get it. Projections and estimates were bad, and growth was bad. So I understand the enthusiasm. But let's talk about specific growth last year. I think that this year the economy will grow more, 2, 3%. The minister insinuated that could even be more than that, 3.7. I think that could be a bit high, but the key point here is that for 10 years now, we have had average growth of 2%, slightly higher than 2%, 10 years now. And this is now affecting us. It's affecting us on the fiscal side and the social development side. It's people are unhappy, and I would like to commend the fact that this administration is addressing this now.
Right. We see this discontent and frustration in interviews saying that the signs that have been given are enough to practically stagnate investment for a very long time. There seems to be very few possibilities to truly take off in the next years to get to a 4 or 5%. Well, about that, I recently made a brief study about how economies had grown, the ones that had reached the GDP in Chile. They had grown for, 10 years, and the average was something like 2.3%. Thinking of 5% maybe in excess. 4% would be talking about an excellent level, but raising it by 1 point would be excellent, extraordinary, and A few measures for that are precisely in the report, and José Gregorio and I were present. I'm a little more optimistic. There's people that say we're done and Chile can't grow. I think there are opportunities, important ones. For example, renewable energies. They're in this report. They're mentioned. They were mentioned by the minister, by André. So it is important, but it's also important to begin with these initiatives right now. Pepe. Well, in the first place, as an economist, the difference between minus 0.2 and plus 0.2 is the same as 0.8 and 1.2. You're not going to make a show for that, but I understand politics. I understand what Manuel was saying. There is this threshold. There was huge pessimism, and the end of the year proved to not be as bad, but the economy is not really recovering since 2021. So we are flat. We've been flat since 2021. It's been 3 years, and the economy has not grown. Now, that's reasonable because we had grown excessively, and that caused inflation, imbalances, and the economy needs to correct that. And the last few figures by the IMASEC, the last one was positive, and you see the market projections. We see the forecasted growth of around 2%. And I share with Rodrigo that we know, and fortunately Brazil, Chile, Latin America, and I'm very positive in that sense, much more than many of my colleagues in the international scenario. Latin America, the main problem of Latin America, the main concern that we had 20, 30 years ago has been solved. And before, everything in this fiscal policy, there are risks, and you say this can happen, and we are, we're concerned, otherwise you can't really see. But Latin America had an inflationary exposure, and all of the economies but it is incredible. But where are we? We're lost in growth. The ones that grew most were Brazil and Mexico, and all of us are around 2%. And we heard that from the minister. The main problem in the emergent world is that we've grown less. But, what's curious here, but here's the GDP per capita. In terms of productivity, we're not really, we're closer, but we invest, we do everything, but we can't really reach that level. So how do we do things? And that's where our challenge lies. As Rodrigo said, we can maybe improve by 1 point, 1.5, but we're doing things that, and I always say this with the political system, this is the entire region. We have a difficult political system. It's difficult to pass reforms. We're doing productive things, and many reforms are basically based on slogans because they're interesting and they help for the elections, but they don't help the economy. So continuing with the political realm and leaving this as a concern and inflation on the way to normalizing in the market, we have, in the last few weeks, we've heard that, and this did come from the Minister of Labor's comments. She said that large corporations should pay better. And this gave way to a discussion on the labor market and informality, which was also mentioned by the minister. I would like for you to comment on this. What is behind this debate, and what does this kind of vision do? is this what's happening in the economy and the labor market? I will begin with Rodrigo, just to change the order. Well, that's interesting. You know, many times you hear all sorts of comments, some more fortunate than others, but that was quite different. It sounds very political, electoral. It gives an electoral sensation because there's a certain kind of audience that would find those declarations or statements attractive. We'll see at the end of the year. But of course, I feel that has no foundation, and I think she's a little lost. I believe that the salaries and everything, well, what I'd like to emphasize is that we're talking about growth. There's no other way, there's no other lasting source for generating employment and salaries than by growing. So if we want better wages, we need to discuss these measures. Now, Marilee, you also asked about the labor market. Yes, of course, there's concern about the labor market because it hasn't recovered. If we had recovered the levels of employment and of the labor market prior to the pandemic, that would be different. We haven't recovered the trend. The trend is still a little above the effective levels. So there's still a significant percentage of the labor force that has not gone back to work and that are not employed, that have not recovered under those metrics. So I feel that the discussion about the labor market is quite relevant, and it is closely related to the discussion on growth and pensions, right? Because with that level of labor market, it's impossible to continue to discuss an increase in pension fund quotations. Well, this is a problem that blows up every time we hear about informality and unemployment, but it doesn't go beyond that, does it? Well, you know, I come from the left, from the Socialist Party. It's true, but there is a part of the left that I don't like, which is that it wants better salaries. It wants to distribute income, and it wants for it to be better. It wants many things. But wanting is not enough. You need to do things so that they happen. You need public policies for things to happen. And that is very typical of the Latin American left. Sweden is a country that had 40 consecutive years of a socialist government, and that's what made it what it is today. So these kind of populist things cause harm, and this government of Gabriel Boric is not, well, that's more how it began, but now it's becoming a little bit more pragmatic. So amongst these things that can be done and that have an impact on employment and on growth and other things, you know, in the report of this committee that we were sharing with other people, there was a very simple exercise that analyzed numbers. It's not a theory. According to the list of advanced economies in the IMF's report, which are the economies that entered this category after the Second World War? And we looked at the figures, and we saw that in all those economies, without a single exception, exports were growing more than the GDP for 30 consecutive years. We calculated 30 years. So in Chile, with the 0.2% that we saw, and reviewing the national accounts, we see again that we've had over 10 years where exports have systematically grown less than the GDP. That means, let me go back to Minister Jara. It's not enough to want something. You need to take a look at what the economies that pay good salaries have done, the economies that grow more. We need to learn from good experiences to achieve this. So, Manuel, would this, oh, that makes sense. What would we be doing wrong in Chile to prevent the exporting sector that was Chile's engine to continue growing in the 90s, sorry, to continue growing? You know, there's stagnation on the salmon industry, on the agricultural industry, on the mining royalty that the minister said was such a great achievement. It could be affecting the sector. So what is happening that it's not happening?
Porque siempre hay cosas.
Well, I think it's always more important to focus on the environmental regulations. Anyhow, that's what they say. I think that has been the noticeable change. That's what I've noticed over the last 6 to 8 weeks in terms of the government's discourse. And that has led me to be more optimistic, is more pragmatic. Now, this is government-wide, or would you just say this is related to certain sectors of the government? Well, the government, I mean, all of the governments are heterogeneous, and the coalitions are heterogeneous as well. Minister Jara is from a sector that has not grown or have not been renewed. But I am optimistic because there is a key sector of the government that started with not much of experience, but lots of willingness and enthusiasm to make changes across the board, and they have realized that that's not the way forward. So I have been growing in optimism. I think Mario Marcel has been a guru, the patriarch, as the oldest of all of them. He has led them. And he's older, he's less than he's younger than I am. He's older than them, but he's younger than I am. And he has been guiding them towards a better path, on a better way. So I think for the left, if you would allow me, I know I might be the only one from the left here. No, you're not. Anyhow, I think it's important for the left to not just have the energy and start, but it's important to finish, to wrap it up. What do you think? Are you optimistic? I would like to mention two comments regarding my colleagues' remarks. First of all, we need this whole comment about the populist comment about how we need more taxes. Well, let's just pay more taxes, add more. I mean, that's just ridiculous. But what we need to do is think about what we are going to do. And the minister has said we're going to do things against tax evasion. People should pay what they're supposed to pay. And you could also look into the labor market. Maybe there could be more payments there. I agree that the labor market is essential. It's crucial. It's that is related to economic growth and productivity and better wages, better salaries. But the labor market is quite complex today. And when you analyze it, well, I have seen the data left and right, and I'm not fully convinced. I don't have a final decision. Some people look at the data and can paint a picture quite well, but I can't. So what Rodrigo has said is very interesting. Everything you say is interesting, but in this specific case, Chile actually was able to have we've reached the pre-pandemic labor force and labor market level. But if we think that we're going to grow at 1% a year, we are going to be behind, still lagging behind. And that's why people say there's a 300,000 job post gap. But if you look at the employment rate, we're quite cold here, and we need an extra 100,000 job posts. And then private salary employment is less dynamic. So We do not have comparative international data. I was looking for them, but I couldn't find them. There are other phenomena, but I think that the world has seen more self-employed individuals. Not everyone is focusing on full-time employment. Right, independence is equal to informal market. We have a lot of independent or self-employed. We don't know if they're all informal or formal. We have a bit of everything. We have self-employed who pay their taxes and pay their pension fund, and this is all related to the discussion that we have regarding the Uber law, and we need to protect the labor markets without destroying its flexibility. That's very important because that's the way the world is today. The Mercurio front page had the 2.5 million informal workers, and this, if we address informality with being independent or being self-employed and having to pay your taxes and pay your own pension fund, it's challenging and it's a high figure. Well, the statistics show us, the statistics report on self-employed. We cannot say that they're informal or formal workers. Many of them are probably informal, but there are different types of informal economy. Now, in the past, a lot of people who worked through the apps were informal, but now they're becoming more formal. So they are starting to pay taxes. That's something we're working on. I don't have the right information to come up with a very definitive statement. We could continue talking about Chile, but I have three monetary policy experts in front of me. And this week we're all focusing, all eyes are on the Fed. The central bank of Japan, after 17 years, actually changed its rate. So what do you guys have to say about that? We are all waiting on the Fed. I think the Fed, and this is happening in several developed countries, the most recent inflation data have been positive. So the question you have to ask yourself is what's going to happen going forward? What's going to happen when we do away with this monetary contraction? The rates have been raised, so we have to see that everything, we have to wait for things to settle down, and we have to see the movement. It's likely that this will take some time. We have seen the rates have been dropped, but it still might be some time for things to really change. And where are we going to end up? Where is Chile going to end up? Where is everyone going to end up? What is going to be the final rate? Is it going to be 0 in Europe or 2 in US? And the high debt rates in the United States lead me to believe that the rates will not be so low as they have been in the past. So monetary policy is key here. As far as Chile is concerned, the rate, as the central bank said, our normal rate should be 4%. So the question is, how quickly will we get there? I think we should be closer to that, but the situation is slightly more challenging today. So we need to be more aggressive on the monetary policy side. I think the most remarkable aspect of recent times has been the tremendous growth in the U.S. Now, despite a series of geopolitical factors that could have affected, or at least led to more of a slowdown, the U.S. economy has been quite sound. It has maintained extremely low unemployment rate, and I think this is great news. I think it's been the biggest surprise in 23. It has been doing much better than the rest of the developed economies. We know Europe has been slow, UK a bit better, but the US, great. So given that context, inflation has dropped. It's less than the target. It's higher than the target, but it's still less than in the past. And a few months ago, we thought it would drop quicker We thought that the interest rate would drop quicker, and there's this whole discussion as to whether it's going to be 2 or 3 in terms of growth rate, but the economic context has been better than what we expected. And I think that does away with some of the pressure to have such a quick drop in the interest rate. And then secondly, there's a very interesting discussion today in the United States with regard to the optimal rate. So the inflation was 2.5%, roughly. That's what we're looking for. And so this expected.
economista más vocal en esto ha sido el ex secretario del Tesoro.
So this, Gary Summers was saying that this expected rate, or the rate that we're working with to get there, is higher than expected. So the reach rate is higher. He's also said that could be higher, but I think we also need to ask ourselves in Chile about this so-called reach rate, and it's estimated to be 4%, inflation plus 1. So it's the target rate, essentially. So this, it's either the target rate or the neutral rate. And do you think we need to start talking about that? To think about that possibility? I don't think we should start necessarily talking about it. It's something that we talk about it all the time. Every year, there's they calculate the neutral rate. So I think it's an interesting topic that is creeping into the international debate scenario. We're not talking about major leaps and bounds, maybe just half a point higher. And that is going to have an impact on fiscal policies. Let's not forget that the situation today is different than it was following the wars, and fiscal policy with higher rates makes for a more complex situation, and there could be some macro leaps and bounds globally and in the region. Specifically for the countries that have a lot of debt, they'll have to continue to go into debt, and at higher rates it's more expensive. One of the concerns as far as the situation is that the countries that are more in debt are going to have to pay more than they have had to pay in the past. What do you think about this? So I have a puzzle that I can't seem to make all the pieces fit. So I don't necessarily have all the pieces, as I mentioned, but I'll try. So there's a huge fiscal deficit in the U.S. Wait, one moment. $1.7 trillion a year net new debt, in addition to existing debt. So the Fed accumulated a lot of bonds during the quantitative easing, and this is at roughly $1 trillion per year. So if you have high interest rates, you will have excess supply, and the values, the rates, the figures are not consistent with having a relatively low figure. And then the members of the FOMC, those who actually make the decisions within the Federal Reserve, most of them think that the neutral interest rate in the United States will converge at very low levels, at the very low levels that we recently saw. Now, these are not two compatible situations. I think that the most recent statement by the FOMC was a bit more dovish than the circumstantial drops in rates of certain markets. But following these statements by the members of the Fed, the rate creeped up. So the market has been very unstable since then. So this more hawkish, more recent discourse, I think we will see that in the statement tomorrow. I might be wrong because we're not fortune tellers, but I do not think there will be any drop in the interest rate during the first quarter in the U.S. In the second quarter, because the macroeconomic situation does not allow for that. And reducing inflation, the reduction was quite sudden, but less sudden for core inflation, but less sudden for effective inflation as well. So I think the market really wants the Fed to drop the rates, but that's similar to the situation with Minister Jara. Thank you. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I'm sorry. I'm a little bit dizzy from the socks over here. His socks are making me dizzy. Well, these are quite toned down. I have a quick question to close this discussion. Let's assume it's 2025. The four of us are seated here talking about what? What do you think we'll be talking about? Chile with the 3% growth, or I think we're going to keep going on as we have in the past, and we're going to be bitter. There's a lot of political uncertainty, what's going to happen, how things are going to settle. We have a lot of pending issues still, so I think it'll be the same next year. So at least we'll have some work. I think maybe we could have higher growth in 24 that we did have in 23, and then of course it'll be electoral period. So next year we will be talking about the lead candidates platform, and I hope that growth is a key component on those platforms. Manuel, I think that as far as the low figures are concerned, I think we will be less pessimistic in a year's time, slightly less pessimistic and slightly less optimistic as well, if that's possible. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.